All right, we are ready for our next talk. Like I said, Dave is the only person holding you back from lunch, so make him feel it while you're out there. All right, so Dave Lewis. First and foremost, beyond anything, Dave is a good friend. Known him for quite a few years. Really appreciate him coming out. He spoke at was one of our opening keynotes at HughesCon, 2 years ago, I think. Not last year, year before. So he's a global advisory CISO and head of special operations at 1Password. So if anybody, I use 1Password. Who uses 1Password? Okay, write that down. That was really. So he brings 30 years of experience in IT security, operations, and management. Founder of actually a really good podcast, Liquid Matrix Security Digest and Podcast. Has held roles at Duo Security, Akamai, Cisco, AMD, IBM. 9 years in critical infrastructure. That's obviously very important to a lot of us here in Houston. He is Canadian, so forgiving him his accent, but it'll work out generally. He says oot in a boot. Sorry, I had to give you crap on it. Well, they just cut me off because I made fun of you. That was rough. I do not know what you're telling me right now, brother. I don't know sign language. Go to the other one. Oh, hold it up. Yeah. I got to hold it. You remember how, like this? That was Oak Ridge Boys, the bass singer, sang like this. Yeah. So former board member of ISC Squared, and he did some good over there, but you tried. Yep. B-Sides Las Vegas as well, founder of B-Sides Toronto. 13 years as a DEF CON speaker operations goon. That's a long time to be doing that stuff. We know speakers are the best part of our thing. Serves on the Black Hat Sector Advisory Board and 44 Con CFP Review Board. Has written for Forbes, CISO Online, Huffington Post, Daily Swig, and more. I want to welcome Dave Lewis to the stage.
Thanks, Buzz. All right. Whoop. There we go. Cool. I just had an echo there, so I had to thank you very much for having me here, and also thank you for allowing me to actually enter the country. I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, but in a previous administration, not unlike the current one, I wasn't actually able to enter the country for 9 months. That was a whole lot of fun. I was a Canadian working for a Canadian company in Canada, and I was accused of stealing American jobs. And I was like, no, you can keep your jobs. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So I do appreciate the intro. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here in front of everyone. And yes, I have done all sorts of things. The one thing that we didn't actually cover, which because I just throw it out there, I was part of a defense contractor as well for a few years, and I did work for DISA and all sorts of other agencies. So it was really an interesting thing. All right. So as a result of working at 1Password, I have a bit of a novel thing that I've never really experienced at other organizations, in that I'm able to support external parties as well. So I do work for a company called Sightline Security, and that is a nonprofit that provides cybersecurity services for other nonprofits. So I get to be on the advisory board for that, as well as on the advisory board for BIOS, if you're familiar with their microsegmentation. That's a company I'm helping out there on their advisory board, as well as Gnostic AI. So let's crash into it. So the reason I put this up here is quite literally because every time I talk about 1Password, much like what Michael was talking about earlier, where he said who has it, for 18 years, we were a mom and pop shop selling one thing, a password manager. And in the last year, we have become an enterprise company, and we've really completely changed. Fundamentally, we've become a startup all over again, and the fact that I don't sleep much anymore really is a testament to that. I've been in startup land before, and it really does take a toll on you. So that's why I threw that in there. So as a Canadian, one of the things is we do tend to look at the world a little bit differently, and I'm a big fan of hacking. Thank you. Appreciate you. All right. So this is a story that I use over and over again when I give talks, and it's very succinct why I do this. So this picture here was taken by my former boss when I was over at Duo and Cisco, And she sent this to me when she was coming back from a conference that she had been speaking at. She said, all right, drop everything you're doing. Tell me where I am. I'm like, come on, boss. I'm like, I got work to do. And she goes, yeah, you got work to do for me. Now I want you to do this. I was like, okay, fine. Let's go through this. So I looked at this, and you can't tell right here, but on the far edge of the picture, just outside the picture because the slide cropped it, there you could see the tip of the wing. So I was like, okay, I could see that. I could see where the sun was. I knew what conference she had been speaking at. And I was only allowed to use open source. So I knew her favorite airline from that social media platform that we will not mention. And I pieced together a whole bunch of different things. So I said, okay, is this your flight? And she said, yes, it is. And I said, good. Can I get back to work? Nope. Now she wanted me to tell her what seat she was sitting in. It's like, all right, what seat? Okay, let's have a look. So I pulled the flight manifest, went over to seatguru.com, had a look at it, and said, okay, based on where the wing is, based on the lighting, based on time of day, I figured out that she was in seat 5A. This is kind of how close I was. She was seated in seat 6A. Now, between all of my complaining, going off to get a cup of coffee, and getting this done, can anybody take a wild guess how long this took for me to figure out what seat she was almost sitting in? 10 minutes? Anybody else? No?
30 minutes.
30 minutes. All right. 4. 4 minutes, including my complaining and going to get a coffee. The reason I love telling this story is because it tends to highlight to people how easy it is for an attacker to gain information about your organization. It is really, really simple. And as a result of things like this, I tend to feel like this, very much off kilter, very much yelling at the clouds on a consistent basis. And I get to talk about it at events like HUSECon, which I have to admit was a lot of fun. Come on. Boop. There we go. Unfortunately, a lot of these stories come out of events like things like this. NotPetya is a great example. This was a ransomware that went around in 2017. Or, sorry, masquerading as a ransomware. It turned out to be a wiper software that was hell-bent on destruction. And the thing here is that there are so many of these things that keep cropping up. Data breaches that happen over and over again. How many people remember this one? This was based on a vulnerability that the industry had known about for 10 plus years. When it happened, everybody said, oh, okay, it was a black swan event. I'm like, well, yes and no. It was a massive impact, and in hindsight, everybody said it could have easily been fixed, so I guess technically, yes. The problem here is, why didn't we fix it? Then we look at other things like SolarWinds, pipelines, hotels, like the one we're in right now. And that's not to beat up on any of these. The reason I bring up these is these are great examples that we can collectively learn from. And unfortunately, we seem to repeat a lot of the lessons that we should have learned. When I was talking about black swan events earlier, it's like, these are the kind of phrases you hear a lot. Yeah, that could never happen on our network. Oh, wait, that impact actually hurt. And I can totally see how that was a problem in hindsight. And we're very good at seeing 2020 in the past. But why don't we learn these lessons? And this is really how it seems to be, is that we look at everything and quite literally we take the approach that everything's on fire. Now, passwords are a great example of this, where it's fundamentally the equivalent of a house key. When you lock your door in the morning, you go off to work, you go off to the grocery store, whatever it happens to be. If you lose that key somewhere along the line, somebody finds it, they can gain access to your house if they know it's your key. And honestly, that's not that big of a stretch. There's a lot of times where people will put pictures of their family on there or a tag saying, if lost, return to X. And this is why I look at passwords in the same vein. It is a control, but not a security control. And this is why we have to be able to do better. There are technologies that can do better. Passwordless technology, biometrics, whatever it happens to be, multi-factor authentication. And yet we're still stuck with dealing with passwords. And this is big business for a lot of people. For example, this particular Vietnamese gang, 4 people, were able to rake in, let me bring that up there, $71 million from their operation. just using stolen credentials to be able to gain access to other parties. And these sort of stories pop up over and over again when you look at the missteps of how technology was implemented. At one company I was working at, I used to work for a power company that was originally part of a very large organization that was split into 5 smaller companies. One day we had this ARP storm going throughout our network. We couldn't figure out where the point of origin was, and so we had gone through all the logs, all the files, couldn't for the life of us figure out what the point of origin was. So at one point, I finally just threw my hands up and I said, we got to do a hard target search, and I went out onto the raised floor, got the tile lifter, pulled the tile up, nothing there, just a bunch of wires. Next tile. And then the third tile I pulled up, there was a Cisco 1750 blinking back at me. This was a hardwired connection back to another company that we used to be part of the same family, but this other company was now ostensibly a competitor. This was a huge problem. We had a direct connection to a competitor. Thankfully, we had friends over there, called them up and said, this is what we found, and they went and they found a similar one under the floor in their facility. Luckily, nothing bad came of this. Unfortunately, luck is not a strategy. These are the kind of problems that compound to lead us into various issues from a security perspective. And then when you overlay the flaming sword of justice, it gets so much worse. Now, the flaming sword of justice is a character that I bring up over and over again, who I used to work with at another power company a long, long time ago. And his raison d'etre was to go around and see how he could get anybody fired for any sort of minor indiscretion. People that had gone to surf lolcats or went to Twitter or whatever it happened to be. And he would literally file a report with their manager and the CISO at the time and saying this person needs to be terminated for these reasons. Thankfully, he had no power to do any of this. And yet, it instilled a very negative attitude within the organization, because nobody wanted to talk to security. And at that time, he was InfoSec. I was on the network security side. Nobody wanted to talk to him. They always kept coming to me and my team because we treated them like adults. And this was a real problem. And unfortunately, I see this sort of thing play out over and over again in organizations, less so these days, thank goodness. But it does tend to crop up over and over again. So what I'm going to be talking about today here is I'm going to be switching over to talking about how SSO is not the panacea that we think it is. This is one of those technologies that, yes, it is good as part of a larger implementation to protect your organization, but it is not as great as some people have made it out to be. I'm going to talk about how shadow IT sneaks into your organization and grows, and the real drivers behind insecure behavior on the part of users. We got to look at how do we architect our security access strategy in a way that makes sense. And we also have to account for, as we heard from the panel a little bit earlier, the rise of agentic AI. And it's really funny, we were just talking about this earlier off stage, that it's almost like there was a meeting and everybody got together and a few weeks ago said, oh, we all have to talk about agentic AI. And it's like, oh wait, RSA's coming. Oh, yeah, there we go. Let's get that buzzword going. But the reality is this is a technology that is bubbling to the surface very quickly. And the thing is, AI is not something that has just shown up. This has been around for decades. If you ever order a pizza, things to that effect, there is AI built into the background there. The one thing that really brought it into the forefront for most people is the advent of ChatGPT. And yes, that's an LLM, but it really was a catalytic event, and it got people to think of it. It became right in the front of their thought processes. So SSO feels safe, right? We're sold that bill of goods saying this is how you're going to protect your organization, but the problem is it only knows what it can see. And a lot of times there's the SSO tax of organizations have to pay extra in order to get their application behind SSO as an example. And it doesn't have to be that way. While it's convenient, that sort of convenience can lull us into complacency in that we think that everything is secure within our environment. And fundamentally, that's not the case. It leads to data breaches. Wow, my mouth did not want to speak there for a second. All right. And unfortunately, this is the kind of thing that we see over and over again. This is a slide that I update and use repeatedly. This is a site called informationisbeautiful.net, and they track all the world's data breaches. The bigger the ball, the more of an impact it was. So for example, the Indonesian SIM cards, 1.3 billion records Ticketmaster, 560 million. Facebook, 500 million. This is not getting better. I remember when I was tracking these sort of things back in 2012, because apparently I needed a hobby, that the biggest one at the time that was publicized was a data breach at LinkedIn, and that's not to beat them up, but it was between 6.7 and 6.9 million records. And that was front page news. Nowadays, it's a blip on the horizon. Now, where SSO fails is that it has that incomplete coverage. You have weak policy enforcement for the most part, because time and again I see organizations that will roll these things out, and it's a Ron Popeil method of set it and forget it. They'll implement it and say, okay, it's good, it's got the machine that goes ping, let's move on. But as a result of the fact that it can only see certain applications that are enrolled within it, it has poor visibility within your network. So, the blind spot. So this is about a vendor that had their support system compromised. And the overview here is back in 2023. This particular vendor, who I won't name because I'm not going to bash them about the head and neck, their support system was compromised, and the attackers were able to gain access to session tokens, and it affected a whole bunch of their customer base. Now, the breach originated when the attackers were able to steal logins, and it was a case of they got in with the username and password. They were able to compromise somebody who worked at the company, and they were able to get in and cause all sorts of havoc. But because only certain parts of the organization were covered by SSO, they couldn't see the fact that the SSO vendor had been compromised and was compromising other systems within the environment. You can see how this spirals out of control very quickly. The key takeaways here was, we have to look at federated identity risks, session token security, and a timely disclosure. One of the biggest problems here in this particular case was the aforementioned vendor took a very, very long time to disclose that this had actually happened. And one of the companies that was affected by this that I know were able to detect weird activity as a result of this and report it to them, and it took a while before they admitted that yes, they had been compromised. So thankfully, it didn't cascade too badly in that particular case, because the vendors that were, or the companies rather, that were affected by the vendor breach did have other controls in place. The compensating controls were able to offset, but that's not always going to be the case. Now, shadow IT is one of those things that comes up time and again. Now, shadow IT is really about people trying to get their jobs done. It's not a negative in of itself, because people don't sit down and say, how am I going to ruin my company's day-to-day? I know I'm going to spin up a project and tell nobody about it. No, they're just trying to get their job done. They're trying to execute on their timelines, trying to meet their goals, and as a result, they do the stupid thing. They'll set up a system that has direct access to the internet, no security controls in place, using production data. You can see how this bouncing ball goes. And this, yes, I just covered off of that. And that's just it. You run into budget overruns, you run into possible compliance issues, you run into all sorts of security ramifications, all because somebody was trying to do the right thing to get their job done. And it's unfortunate, but the people that usually set these systems up don't have any sort of security background. They'll be very good at what they're very good at, but that's the long and the short of it there. Come on. Boop. There we go. And the attackers know this. So this is also from informationsbeautiful.net. This is ransomware events over the years. So if we look, let me see, do I have a laser? No, I don't have a laser. On the left-hand side of the screen, we see the bigger the ball, that means the larger the target. And as we progress across to 2023, which was the most recent data, much smaller footprint for these organizations. The attackers going after these smaller organizations because these SMBs and mid-market organizations, while they have a security program in place, they don't necessarily have the resources in order to best protect themselves. The catch here is a vast majority of these small companies have agreements with other larger companies to provide them services. So if the attackers can get one of these, they can pivot into a larger organization. One high-tech manufacturer I worked for, about 15 years ago, we did an entire assessment of all the connections into our network, and we found that of the 300 or so companies that were there, 16 were documented. And when I say 16 were documented, that means there was a document with their name on it. 4 or 5 of them were fully documented. A lot of these had routers that were interconnecting us using the credentials of vendor name, password, vendor name, and I'm sure you can figure that one out. And it's really unfortunate because it didn't have to be like that. So, why does shadow IT happen? Speed and convenience, the perceived lack of any sort of IT solution that can help them get their jobs done, and the need for innovation and experimentation. Innovation is one of those things where every organization is expecting it to happen, but they don't necessarily give them the runway they need in order to do these sort of things. So a lot of times you're left with the imagery of building a plane that's already in flight. And as a result, you run the risk of issues with data security, as one particular example, unauthorized access to production data. The risk of loss of data, this is a real problem, because a lot of the threat actors, they pivot over time. So when I was in my early days of my career, if a site got compromised, people would put up that page, greets to all my friends, yada, yada, yada. It would show up on AllDAS, attrition.org, ZoneH, all of these defacement mirrors. That was the big concern years ago. Nowadays, the attackers grab the data, they encrypt it, then they offer to sell it back to them, and then even after they pay the ransom, then the attackers will then pivot and then sell it to the next highest bidder because they don't care. The risk of compliance. There's various different compliance regimes around the world, and there's more cropping up every day. It's like playing whack-a-mole. And then we have layer in the AI legislations coming out. We've seen the AI Act in UK. We've seen that United Arab Emirates even has a minister responsible for AI at this point. And it is definitely growing very quickly because AI is going to outpace a lot of the security community if we're not careful about it. And then there's the risk of the bottom line. If you are compromised and all of your data ends up in whatever forum, there's a real possibility that's the end of your company. I remember one travel company in Europe, this was quite a few years ago, it was discovered that if you went into the URL for your flight and said, whatever it happens to be, the last, I think it was 7 digits or 8 digits, if you changed one of those digits off by 1, you got somebody else's booking. And you could do this for you could just walk through the whole directory structure. They were out of business 24 hours later. How many people have had a beige desktop in their production environment running mission-critical code written by a summer student and nobody knows how to port it off? Oh, come on, you're lying. Sorry? Well, you know how to turn it off. And that is actually quite a skill that a lot of people don't have. This is the kind of thing that pops up time and again. And this is not exactly shadow IT, but it has a similar impact. If you're not able to patch these systems and it has legacy vulnerabilities, and heaven forbid it is connected directly to the internet, there could be grave consequences as a result of this. Come on. Boop. Another example of this is the system that is not properly documented, not properly maintained, and there's no sort of escalation tree in the event that something goes wrong. One power company I was working at, we had this one server that, again, much in the same vein as the story of the ARP storm, we had a server that was causing unbelievable amounts of traffic on the internal network, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. So we went through our contact sheet, and we found that this particular server had no identified owner, no identified escalation tree. Nobody actually had any idea what application was running on it. Bad documentation on our part. But eventually it got down to the point that it was impacting other services. And I realized that there is nothing good about this. So, much in the same vein as the gentleman there, I went and I pulled the Ethernet cable on it, and I tied a note to it, and I hung it on the rack, and I left. Sure enough, we finally found out who the project manager was, a gentleman named Nick. He came in screaming in my face that this system is mission critical, it has to be up, beat red. And I just looked at him and I said, okay, Nick, come with me. We walked out onto the raised floor, I walked over to the rack, and I went, pulled the note off, and I handed it to him. It was signed on the seal and dated, and he looked at it and he says, what's this? And I said, that's for you. He opened it up, just seething, vein popping in his forehead, looks at it, all of a sudden he regains his composure, folds it up, thank you for your time. He left. Can anybody tell me how long that note had been sitting there? You were very close, 9 months. 9 months before he noticed that his mission-critical server was down. And these are the kind of things that if you don't have that visibility in your environment, and that's just not just an SSO thing, I tend to meander here, but these are the kind of things that can lead to complications. So if it hadn't been touched in 9 months, it's entirely possible it wasn't configured properly, it wasn't patched properly. It is a potential pivot point within a network. And people will do strange and interesting things. You know, an example here is the psychology of passwords. You know, my bunny 123, my kid's birthday, whatever it happens to be. We have to understand that when we're building out security solutions that people are going to do the strange thing. And it is always a predictably strange thing. So if you're putting up a control in place that has a limited utility, people are going to do weird things that are going to bypass those controls. So we have to find a better way to cover off those empty spaces. Sort of like looking for change in your sofa cushions. You know that if you drop something on the sofa, you'll pick it up. But if you miss those ones that go through the cushion, that could be a problem in that you wouldn't be able to afford to pay for your pizza. Now, people have this interesting way of rationalizing what risk is for them. There's always the phrase of, oh, just this one time. I'll just try this cookie this one time. When the cookie could be incredibly dangerous for them, they could have diabetes, whatever it happens to be. There's all sorts of different factors that have to be taken into account. Or if they're building out a system, they build out a shadow IT system, they're like, I have to do this because I have to move fast, I have to meet my deadlines. And then IT won't help me in time. Sometimes it's a very valid concern. I've been in organizations where IT was so overtaxed that it was almost impossible to get them to do anything. And that's not to beat them up, that's to beat their senior management up because they weren't given the resources that they need. And I've lived that, yes. And then we have to worry about the security of the data. If you are not properly controlling the access into your environment, your production data could be literally walking out the door. In another power company I was working at, I've worked at a couple of them, there was this one guy, I kid you not, he was literally printing out sheets of paper, yay thick, and stacking them in those big boxes that you get when they terminate you kind of thing. And he filled up these boxes, and they put them on a cart, and he rolled them out the door. I'm sitting in my office just watching this. It was one of those cube farms, and I'm just watching him wheel it out. I look out the window, and I see him going out to his car and putting it in the trunk. Okay. So after about 3 or 4 trips of just sheets of paper, I realized this something is very hinky. So I went down and I talked to our physical security team, and I showed them, and I said, here, check the video on the parking lot. And they're looking at me like, what the hell is he doing? No word of a lie, this guy had actually printed out all of the source code for the project that he was working on for day-ahead markets. Printed it out, put it in boxes so he could take it out the door. Not something that was in my threat modeling, I'll be honest. But these are the kind of things we have to look at when we're trying to protect our environments. People are going to do the weird things. Especially when you look at it and people storing data locally on their laptops. Unfortunately, this happens all the time. I have been guilty of this many times because I'm a road warrior, so I tend to store stuff on my laptop. Thankfully, my laptop's encrypted and all the rest of it and backed up properly, but these are the kind of things that we have to look at. We have to look at ways to improve our security. So SSO is a certain amount of extent, looking at extended access management to further that out, that connective tissue that's often missing within an enterprise setup, and also having strong data, policies in place to have control over your data in your environment. And when I say having those policies, I don't mean write it, leave it there, and don't look back at it for another 14 years. Security awareness, it's a funny thing. I always find 2 camps. People say security awareness is a great idea, and other people say it's a complete and total waste of time. But security at its fundamental core is a human problem. We have to approach it in that manner because if we are going to get mad at people for doing silly things, did we actually empower them and enable them to be able to do the proper things? Then we have to learn the lessons from data breaches because unfortunately, they keep happening. As you saw from that slide earlier, they're getting larger and larger and larger. And XKCD is a great way to keep your sanity, by the way. Looking at major data breaches that happen in the news is a great way to learn lessons as well. because while they won't necessarily put all of their necessary information in there, there's a lot of times that information has to be filed with the SEC and things like that. You can pull that and learn some valuable lessons. Not to beat them up, but just so you don't end up ending up in the same situation that they are. And that last point there is one of those ones that comes up time and again of insufficient employee training. We have to not only give them the tools to better secure their environment, but helping them understand exactly what that means. So when it comes to shadow IT, this shows the kind of impact that this can have. Capital One back in 2019 had a misconfigured WAF rule that allowed access to their environment, and that caused for the breach of 100 million credit cards. In 2016, which was this Uber, 57 million user records and driver records were compromised because of a GitHub repository that was accessible. Unfortunately, the GitHub repository thing comes up over and over again. I've found companies that will remain nameless that were backing up their production system to a cloud-based backup system that you could actually access without having to log in because they had misconfigured it. And then Dow Jones in 2017, 2.2 million customer records were exposed through an unapproved Amazon S3 bucket. Now, S3 buckets is a very, very simple example, but the reason I bring it up is because it happens time and again. There was a period there just during the pandemic where S3 buckets were leading to so many data breaches that it was like journalists were doing a copy-paste on all their articles, and it kept happening over and over again. The problem here is S3 buckets are easily spun up, and you don't have to have anything other than a credit card to be able to do so. And that's fundamentally troubling because I went through and I did set up one of these just to test it, and they have in bold print, do not make this publicly accessible unless you absolutely know what you're doing. I even wrote an article with screenshots for Forbes, and I put it there, and I still had people asking me questions about it, and it was like, this is not that difficult to understand. Apparently it was. So we have to look at innovative ways to protect data within our environments, making sure you have resilient security systems, proactive security measures, and all the rest of things like that. Regular audits are absolutely essential. And we have to look at the future of cybersecurity through a lens of what can and will go wrong. Zero trust architecture is one of those things that comes up a lot, and either you like it or you spit on the floor when you hear the term, but it's fundamentally about reducing risk in your environment. It's not magic. It really is just about risk reduction. Looking at microsegmentation and secure service edge, extended access, not only SSO, that should say only. And one of the things that keeps coming up again, a lot of conversations, especially in Europe, is people are talking about cyber insurance. Cyber insurance will not make you whole in the event of a data breach. It'll pay for the investigation, it'll pay for the bare minimum of the communications, but it will not make you whole again. So you have to make sure that when you're having this, this is not a get out of jail free card. Come on. Whoa, what's going on here? Okay, so the slides are changing here, but not down here. So I'm going to have to read over here. So when you're looking at security issues within your environment, you have to think of something called the 10th person principle. Now, this is based on a doctrine that came out of the Israeli military back in the Yom Kippur War, where they realized that everybody was in agreement that the sky was blue, and that was the end of the discussion. But they never considered the alternatives of what could happen. So the idea here is, how do we look at it from the perspective, if you say nobody can ever breach our systems, you should have that 10th person that their entire job is to think what can and will go wrong. Because unfortunately, we as humans, we tend to agree with each other. We want to be communities. We want to come together. And sometimes as a result, we may lose our track as to what that exactly means. And unfortunately, that can and will lead to data breaches. And one of the reasons we bring up these sort of conversations when we look at something like we heard about on the panel earlier of agentic AI. Oh, can I have my clock back? All right, I'm winging it now. So we've heard so much about generative AI. We've heard just absolutely scads of this. We've seen deep fakes, all that sort of nonsense. But what has really come to the forefront in really the last few months is a lot of the conversation around agentic AI. This isn't really new. It just, for whatever reason, is being brought into the forefront of people's discussions. Agentic AI, these are agents that are going to be able to make decisions on your behalf within your environment to do a specific task. You don't want to give these agents too many things to do because obviously they would bog down, much like a certain firewall vendor that will remain nameless, that if you turn on a certain service, the whole thing would drop to its knees. I'm not bitter. These agents would have the ability to have autonomy, adaptability, and goal orientation, so they're making decisions for you on your behalf, helping to better protect your network. There's a lot of great technology that's going to be coming down the pipe, and is coming down the pipe right now, that will be able to make your life easier. So if you have a very small cast of characters that is part of your security team, these are the kind of technologies that can and will help. But we also have to understand that a lot of these agentic AI products are being spun up in order to be adding to productivity, not necessarily taking security into account. And when we're not taking security into account, bad things can happen. So one company I was working at, we had a KVM room. I always love telling this story. Unfortunately, ours didn't have any windows. It was a windowless room, cinder blocks, all the best. And we'd come in and we'd be able to sit there and access our production systems if we had to make any sort of changes. And we had to do it in a change window, all that sort of fun stuff. One day I just got so fed up because all of those systems were taken up, I just went, all right, whatever. I went back to my desk and I was sitting there staring out the window. I thought, I wonder if I can get it there from my desktop. Sure enough, remote desktop was accessible to all of my systems that were protected and only could be accessible from the KVM room. It was security theater. The Great Oz commanded it, don't look behind the curtain. The problem here is if we're looking at things like agentic AI, which will have a huge benefit for organizations, we have to make sure that security is factored in. And when AI agents are accessing all of these systems on your behalf, they're using credentials, they're using APIs, all of that sort of thing. How are you going to manage that access? If an agent is compromised, how are you going to know? How are you going to be able to change those credentials? I worked at a high-tech manufacturer where they wanted to literally hard code certificates into their chips. That took several weeks of arguing before they dropped that idea completely. When we're looking at security as least privileges, zero trust, all the rest of it, and developers are going to do what developers are going to do. So rather than fight with them, bring them on side, teach them, help them understand how to better improve things. Because as they're developing these technologies, one stolen credential can lead to a compromise. That's all it takes. And when we're not factoring security in at the outset, we end up with things like this. When the internet was born, security was not part of the equation. I was very fortunate to have Scott Bradner as one of my professors when I was doing my grad studies. If you go back and look at the first RFCs, his name is all over them. And he said quite candidly, we messed up. Security was never part of the equation. We have the opportunity to insert that now with agentic AI deployments so that we don't repeat the sins of the past. And this is why we have to have these conversations and learn from these lessons. If an attacker is able to gain access to the credentials in an AI agent and you don't have a way to monitor it or reset it, obviously that can cause all sorts of problems. Anybody remember the LifeX light bulb? There was a light bulb it was quite a few years ago now, which was Wi-Fi connected, and it was used in enterprises. The problem is you could use your laptop to access one of those and pull the credentials off it, and then you would have access to the entire network. The problem here was, in order to fix that, you had to physically replace all of the light bulbs. So if you had a company with 20,000 employees, you can only imagine how many light bulbs that is. Obviously, these days, a lot more companies are hybrid, but that was back when it was a real problem. The cost alone to replace the light bulbs would be ridiculous. And if we're looking at it from a rational perspective, we have to figure out, looking at extended access management as a way to better manage these credentials, because things like this happen. How many people remember the Mirai botnet? There's one, two, good. This was quite a while ago. This was a botnet built using default credentials that were hard-coded into, I think it was 62 different devices at the time. And it was really frustrating. And I remember when I talked about this very recently, I was told, oh, that's old news. And I said, yeah, I know, but is it? Let me just bring that right up to the forefront. The largest botnet DDoS attack to date was in January using Mirai. Everything old is new again. So when these agents are used to launch attacks, and that's Wendy, my former boss, and blessedly now my employee, she was making all sorts of really interesting AI-related issues. But when you're looking at it, how do you verify who's in your, like if you're in a Zoom call, you have 10 people there, or a Signal chat, how do you verify who's in the conversation? We need these sort of technologies in place to be able to check, to make sure, is that a human? Is that the person supposed to be there? We really have to do a much better job. Otherwise, AI agents will be able to enter the chat. Looking at secure credential management, AI identity governance, IT audit and explainability. As we heard earlier, when a human makes a decision, there's no way to trace it back as to how that decision was made. But with systems, we have that ability to do so. Supply chain security. This has been a topic. The very first talk I ever gave was on supply chain security. This has been near and dear to my heart forever, because if I'm going to attack an organization, I'm not going to come through the front door. I'm going to find some library that you're using in your code, and I'm going to go after that. And compliance alignment, because compliance, everybody loves compliance. How do we fix things? We got to address shadow IT in a way that makes sense. Adhering to compliance and protecting against the attacks is a huge thing. Because we look at things like the access trust gap, we have the systems internal to our organization that we know about, and then we have systems that are coming in through BYOD or whatever it happens to be, where people can do the weird thing, and then it can have a direct impact to our organization. We have to look at how we do the crawl, walk, run. Audits, multi-factor authentication, passwordless, well, that comes later, sorry. Visibility and conditional access would be the walk. And then for the run, password access and real-time risk engine to assess threats in the organization. SSO will only get you so far. So extended access management, you're looking at enhanced security, regulatory compliance, data protection, operational efficiency, and audit and monitoring. Now, back in November, my friend Rich Mogul and I gave a talk in Dublin, Ireland, and one of the things he brought up was the, I'm always getting this wrong, incident command system. So part of his job is he would deal with natural disasters and things of that effect, like forest fires, hurricanes, whatever it happens to be, and he would be mobilized and they would go in to triage the event. Now, I mentioned black swan events earlier as to a huge thing from a cybersecurity perspective, but when a hurricane hits, all bets are off. The damage that can be done is insane, and they have to be able to go in and triage the issue. So having a better way to approach this is a way that we can look at how do we improve things in our own organization. Not having some policy that was written 14 years ago and everybody forgot about it, and when things go wrong, we'll pull that document out and look at it. Looking at this, the incident command system, and the URL is right there, where you can go and look at how they do their incident handling for major events, and see how you can map that to your own organization is a really good thing. You want to look at ways you can improve your organization, because the future's already here. We heard about it on the panel earlier about agentic AI in particular. It's already here. So this is not a pie in the sky thing that's coming later. Quantum, yes, that's coming later, but it won't take them long. If you ever want to learn a lot about quantum, look up Jaya Balu. She is absolutely fantastic on the topic. Learn the incident command system, ICS, not ICS. And run ridiculous exercises that you think are improbable. Have the 10th person principle. Have that person on your staff that part of their job or their whole job is to say, well, this could actually happen. And rule it out, or maybe it's something that's viable. So as I wind down here, one of the things that I did at a company I worked at many years ago, is in the first couple of weeks I was on the job, we did a full audit of all the accounts in our environment. We found there were 10 user accounts that were super user status that were no longer part of the organization. And, and while they had that level of access, it was a little bit concerning because one of them had actually been used in the last 2 years. This particular account belonged to somebody who had been gone from the company for 5 years. Can anybody guess what the real problem was with that particular account? Wild guesses. Anybody? Being used as a service account. I heard shared over here. Yes, so somebody was in fact using this as an account to do something very mundane, and they didn't think anything of it. But the real problem was that particular account belonged to somebody who had been dead for 5 years. So the account was still enabled, still had access to the kingdom. These are the kind of things that are completely avoidable if you have something like extended access management in addition to SSO to better protect your environment. Shadow IT is not going anywhere. People are always going to prioritize their convenience. They want as easy as get things done because people are very good at what they're good at. If they're in finance, HR, whatever it happens to be, they don't know cybersecurity. It's incumbent upon us to be able to communicate that forward in a way that makes sense. And control, visibility, context, adaptability, we have to figure out how we can go beyond SSO, how we can improve the shadow IT problem within our organizations and do a better job. You want to be able to inventory the things you can't see and empower users to understand what secure defaults are. And we want to be able to architect systems for the way people actually work. Don't give them tools written by engineers for engineers. Give them something they can use. Come on. There we go. The illusion of control is real. So for example, when I started off here, I was talking a story about my former boss. She gave me this, tell me where I am. Things sometimes don't change no matter how much we try. She sent me this yesterday, said, tell me where I am. These are the kind of things we have to understand is no matter how many times we try to improve security or get our boss or now former boss to play nice, we will end up doing these things over and over again. So we have to put security controls in place that are going to make sense. Thank you very much for listening today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And if you want, drop me an email. It doesn't have to be about this talk. It can be about whatever. I'd be happy to connect with you.